Going live.
Thank you, Daphne. And if you just give me the word live.
Yeah, we're live.
Great, thank you. Welcome back to Senate Education on Tuesday, March 8th, 1:40. We are now moving to S-162. And we had asked those that were most involved, most impacted by this work to gather, have a conversation to see if we might find some compromise. And so I know we've had the group in before. Mr. Francis, can you hear me okay? Okay, just want to act like we were leaning in. And so I guess this is an update in terms of where things are at. We've heard different things, and I'm not sure who best of you to go first. I have Mr. Fannin right here. Does it work for all of you for me to start with Jeff, and then we'll go around? Okay, Mr. Fannin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you, committee. Good to be in person. I had to be here for other reasons, so I couldn't get back in time. So thank you for letting me in the room. We tried. I'll just say that we got 2/3 of the way there. So if you'll remember, there were three parts to the S-162. The first that I'll come back to later, but the first part was about what I call the hiring process. The second part was about what I called the firing process, which was how we process discharges. And the last part was how we talked about testifying. So it was hiring, firing, and testifying, the three parts of the bill. I think we came to, so the second and third parts, we came to agreement with the management associations. I think we're
as presented in the bill, that language.
no, we
Okay,
we made some changes,
okay,
some improvements,
great.
we think, and certainly I think at the right time when we're getting there, right, certainly,
Yeah.
we'll share those out. And that's the process. We worked with the School Board Association lawyer, Chris Leopold, me, I had a field person, Jeff, Jay, Sue. I can't think if anybody else was there. I'm sure there was. It was all on Zoom, and we got the agreement on 2 and 3. Figured out a way to do that, navigate that. We think in a productive way. The hang up is certainly on part 1. We got to a point where we were just going back and forth on dates, and just became, we just could not come to agreement. It became like whack-a-mole a bit on dates. And so we proposed what we thought was, and we met with them several times. So we tried to hear their concerns and address those. And we think we did, which is simply saying they like the status quo, the way it works now. We understood that and heard that. They were concerned about reporting superintendents to for licensing action. So we took that out, and we came up with a simple sentence that really I think is a technical fix in some sense of the word, but that no superintendent shall interfere with a teacher's right to interfere to be offered or accept a new teaching position.
Would you mind telling us what the status quo is right now and how that relates, how that might compare to, if you don't mind me putting on the spot, the region, New England,
Sure,
that kind of thing?
Sure. So we talked about that a little bit too.
Okay.
Some other states that are doing it. So we looked around. So
Yeah.
for example, New Hampshire, that you can leave at any time.
Okay.
New York is 2 weeks notice.
Okay.
Connecticut.
Anytime, 2 weeks notice.
Yes.
Okay.
Connecticut is locally bargained. And New Jersey and Pennsylvania are anytime with 60 days notice.
Okay. And would you remind us what we have on the books right now?
Essentially, a teacher may not break her teaching contract mid-year, and if she does, she cannot teach for the remainder of that school year. Of course, the question mark is she can terminate her contract, if you will, or get out of the contract if she has good cause, for just cause.
And that's determined by the superintendent.
Well, in large measure, yes. And then the superintendents have reported people to the agency, and the agency, I don't think, is probably doesn't want those cases necessarily. And there have been some lawsuits on damages brought by schools, but I think for the most part, those have been modest, if any. The damages, in one case, it was $1, for example, and that was 20 some years ago. There has not been a case in a good long while. So other states do it differently. In theory, you could, if you've got just cause as determined by the superintendent, you can sever the contract. But there are consequences to that.
But if a spouse were to get a new job and you want in another state and you need to sever your contract.
In another state, you certainly could, and you could go.
Oh, I'm sorry. If a spouse were to be transferred to another state and this teacher wants to go with that spouse to the new job and it's January, I'm teaching.
Yes.
My partner gets a new job. We're living in Vermont, but the new job is in California. It's February. If I want what kind of tricky position am I in if I'm the school teacher and I've signed a contract?
You certainly, I would argue that you have just cause to sever the contract.
Okay.
And go to California with your spouse.
Yeah. Okay.
I hope that you would.
Yeah. Well, you've wanted me out of the state for years.
That's not true, but I think we'd all agree that
Okay.
in those situations, that is just cause, and I think the teacher would be able to sever the contract.
Senator Chinden and Senator Hooker.
I just heard you say that there's not been a case for this in some time. Would you also argue that it's likely because the educational workforce landscape has changed during this pandemic burnout stage, that prior to the pandemic, there was less movement and now there's just a lot more need for teachers and there's more interest in possibly shifting districts?
Well, I'll say that we brought forward the concept prior to the pandemic. This has been a long-term issue for us. So it's not because of the pandemic. What we're seeing, frankly, is people just stopping teaching altogether. It's not about wanting to change jobs from one district to another. It's about, I'm done teaching. This is too stressful right now. It's too complex. It's too, all those reasons. And your spouse is a teacher. It's hard right now. And so I'm not hearing people wanting to change jobs so much as I'm done. And that's the bigger issue, I think, in that context.
And, oops, sorry. And so at this point, do we know, like throughout the pandemic, how many instances there have been of teachers quitting in the middle of the year?
It's, going back a half step to Senator Chitten's question is, how many people change jobs? It's not a sizable amount. And how many people quit, to answer your question, Senator Hooker, just quit in the middle of the year? Not that many. There has been a slight uptick over since the pandemic, but I think it's people who are already qualified and ready to retire and just decided maybe I'll teach one more year, and then they get to the winter break. This was more than I wanted, or something like that. So it's been a slight uptick. I checked the numbers a couple months ago at the treasurer's office. Retirees, it went up. Went from like any number of reasons, like 5 went to, I think 14 was last year or something like that.
Okay. And secondly, does this apply to administration as well, leaving in the middle of the year?
In theory, yes. I think their contracts are a little bit different. I don't want to intrude on Jeff Francis's knowledge base on that. I don't follow the superintendents and the principals. Jeff and Jay would be better equipped to answer that question.
Thank you.
Senator Lyons.
So given that, I have a couple questions. One is about whether or not you would see this as appropriate for a local bargaining issue, because now it seems like there's no one's agreeing to anything, changing dates and so on. And Connecticut does it as a local bargaining issue. Would that be even worse than what we're trying to do here because it's already in the state statute?
I think it may not be, given where we are and what we've just gone through. I'm not sure it would be pushing a problem. I would suggest you to another problem, to another
We'd be
venue.
getting it off our table.
It's off your table. Fair enough. I'm familiar.
Yeah, no, I get it. Okay, so yeah, I could see the problem with that. And so while all the discussion is going on, what consideration are we giving to the kids, here it's really hard when children hear that teachers don't want to be working with them in the classroom. It's just terrible, but so how do we solve this problem and also make sure that our kids are held harmless emotionally?
Could not agree more. I mean, I think, and you wouldn't certainly want to keep a teacher in a place where she's not feeling her best to do her best work. So from that perspective, we certainly support wanting to make sure a teacher is there, highly motivated, and every indication is, every education quality measure says the number one determining factor is the quality of the teacher in front of the classroom. So we want to make sure that we have the highest quality folks in front of the classroom who are motivated to be there. And I think all you know, my friends there, the management associations would agree. We want the best and folks in front of the classroom every time. And I would submit to you that that means they've got to have a happy.
Everybody has to be happy.
Yeah, I mean,
No,
and so and there was a great quote I just heard, you know, about masking and students masking. They're, you know, my members are concerned about masking or not masking. But one teacher put it well, you know, as soon as I saw the smile on the child's face for the first time, it removed all doubt. You know, teachers develop, I'm not a teacher, but teachers develop a relationship with kids, students, that's truly unique in many other settings. And so I think that they want to be with these kids, but for any number of family reasons, they have their own families and own obligations. They may want to change jobs and change a job, and that we just wanted to make sure that they could do that.
Well, the other thing, of course, we're hearing is that everyone from Franklin County is moving into Chittenden County, and everyone from the Northeast Kingdom is moving into Washington County. So how, in your conversations about changing the dates and the timeline, how does that all fit? It's concerning. I mean, it really is concerning, because I know, I look at my colleague over there from South Burlington with the highest salary, and it's hard to compete with that when you're living in Enosburg.
Yeah, certainly. And that problem predates, I would submit to you that this bill wouldn't necessarily address that head on.
Yeah.
But we ought to be, that's a separate conversation. I would suggest to you that we ought to be talking about teacher working conditions, which are students' learning conditions. And so absolutely, we ought to be talking about their working conditions. And why is it that a teacher in Enosburg or in Canaan wants to leave? You know, why they go there in the first place, why they leave. We ought to be doing some exploration of that. And I've been involved in an NEA group for a couple of years now with a teacher shortage, and because of the pandemic, it got a little bit haywire. But the Learning Policy Institute has got some great information on this, has done some great research I could share with you.
That would be good.
But that's a different, I would suggest.
No,
That's a
I
different
understand
conversation.
it's different, but if you have an incentive that when someone comes and say, I'm leaving because the salary there is terrible or whatever, then there must be some way that we can keep folks from having to move. You know, I just don't. Oh, well, if you haven't reached agreement on this, it's concerning. That's all. It would be great to hear from the other folks.
Senator Chittenden.
So I gotta say, I'm not very persuaded by the argument that since the teachers can't, that we want to keep them in a job that doesn't pay as much when there's another job that could hire them. I feel like we need to allow for teachers to be fluid. But I'm curious, in your negotiations, did the notion of a contract buyout come out? Imagine where South Burlington, as Senator Lyons just mentioned, if South Burlington poached a teacher, recruited a teacher during a time window and had to pay the district that had the contract on the teacher 10% of that salary. Does that align incentives at all so that South Burlington would have a one-time fee of an additional amount that they would be forced to pay to the other school district to where the teacher is coming from, that they could then use for off-contract hiring and advertising and summer recruitment?
In short, the answer to your question is no, we did not discuss it. It sounds like, I'm a soccer fan, so it sounds like the reserve clause of the Premier English League or something like that. We did not discuss that.
Senator Perschlick.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Jeff. Sorry to make you.
Hello, Chair.
Did you find out what happens in other New England states? I didn't hear you say anything about Maine, Massachusetts, or Rhode Island.
I did not hear back from Maine, I'm sorry, and the other states. I did as best as I could, and I'm low on, I'm sure on their email told them their list.
Same with Massachusetts and Rhode Island?
I did not get Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island are what I lack.
Okay,
I got New Jersey,
All right.
Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New York. But
okay. Well, if you get
certainly,
those,
yeah, I hope to get them.
okay. And did you submit that language to the committee about the why you considered your compromise language that just would forbid the superintendents from interfering with teachers instead of trying to pick a date?
No.
Okay, and
No,
is
not
that,
yet, but I certainly will.
why is that?
Pardon me?
Well, why did you not submit it? Like, are you still like negotiating on that, or is that?
I thought we should get to hear first. I didn't, to this date, and this hearing, and you should hear from Jay, and out of respect for my colleagues. We certainly tried. I will say, give them all the credit in the world for trying to meet and resolve this, and we brought the right people to the table to have the conversation. So I thought, in fairness to them, we're going to come through today at least and have the conversation. We will certainly, after this, share with you the language formally.
Okay, thank you.
And they've seen the language. They don't, I'll let them speak for themselves. I don't think they agree with it. And, but we think it's a good compromise language.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Would you mention, just tell us again, what the language says, just so before we go into the next conversation,
Sure.
what you put on the table?
So it's in the first part of the bill under Title 16, Section 1752A. It's just an additional sentence, no other change to Section A there. It's just a new sentence that reads, no superintendent shall interfere with a teacher's right to interview for, be offered, and accept a new teaching position. And I'm happy to share this, this language, but it's just one sentence. No superintendent shall interfere with a teacher's right to interview for, be offered, and accept a new teaching position.
Okay, Senator Schumer.
How does that fix the first part of A? Is it replacing all of A, the one that says the disqualified to teach in public school for the remainder of the school year?
It does not change that. So the same, the status quo would be there. It's just saying to the superintendent, we thought that this was addressing what Jeff Francis raised, was the concern over the licensing action, which is the bill originally had in it. Towards the end of the bill, had if the superintendent interferes with the right of a teacher to interview and be offered an accepted teaching position, they would be subject to licensing action. That was a problem for them. We heard that. So we just put it up here up front. Assume, and I trust that most superintendents, if not all, are law-abiding citizens, will see the law written as it is and follow the law. But it's there. And likewise, most teachers don't sever their contracts midstream, but there's an escape hatch for just cause kind of thing. So if your spouse goes to California, as was the hypothetical. So it's just, it's not a licensing action. You know, it's just simple. We expect people to follow the law, and I'm sure they will.
Okay, I'm just a little bit confused still, because A says a teacher under contract, blah, 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 without just cause. You're just basically saying you're not, superintendents can't get involved in anything as it relates to the new, somebody interviewing or taking a new job.
It's trying to address what we couldn't, you know, I call it the hiring window. And
Okay.
we kept on opening and closing. So
Yeah.
if you're arguing about whether you're cold or hot in your bedroom with your spouse, if you've ever been through that experience, how large the windows open or close.
Okay,
And we just couldn't figure out a sweet spot for the window.
sure.
And so, okay, stop that, put that aside. We understand that we just thought this was a simple way to address the window problem that we could not solve.
So what happens then with
And
the
so
window? Keep it just going on your analogy. What's,
So a teacher,
yeah,
if she, so the two witnesses that you heard from, the two teachers,
yeah,
they would have been permitted to interview for a job
right.
without interference. Yes, that is true. That in the assuming that the superintendent followed that, if this were to become law, they would follow the law, which I assume they would. And so they would be able to interview for a job while under contract. The one then would argue, perhaps, that she severed the agreement without cause. Then you get into that interplay, but that's current. We're not changing that. And if her spouse or his spouse
Yeah,
takes a job, you're teaching in Canaan, and they take a job in Bennington,
yeah,
you're not likely to make that commute every day.
right. Senator Lyons.
So the language that you have, you mind just reading one more time?
Sure. No superintendent shall interfere with a teacher's right to interview for, be offered, and accept a new teaching position.
Okay, so that is a question that I was going to ask of the superintendents, that how many times has this intervention happened? Is this a consistent practice? I mean, we certainly heard that it happens. So, and how does it happen in other, you don't know the answer to this probably, but there are other businesses and business practices where you can reach out and put someone on a blacklist. This sounds like that kind of process. So it is a bit concerning. It has been concerning to me from the beginning. And so I will ask that question later on.
Well, certainly, having worked in the private sector, I could change jobs and that's permissible, and no matter what. And we understand the teaching. We want a great teacher in front of the classroom, August 20th or whatever the start date is. We absolutely want that. We don't want to upheaval in the classroom. We're not looking for that. But we also want to make sure that people can find the job that best suits them and their family's needs, and without interference from the superintendent or getting permission from their boss to even interview for another job that is posted, that's closer to home, that's closer to the kids' daycare, whatever the case may be.
Right. I think the issue is it's become so embedded in all the other concerns that we have about workforce availability and inequitable reimbursement across the world state. Yes, but to isolate this as a practice, I think is really important.
Yes, but I think, again, that goes to my earlier conversation. I'm happy to get you some stuff from the Learning Policy Institute.
Yeah.
That's about job or work environment that predates the pandemic.
Right.
And how do we incent people to stay in the teaching? How do we attract and retain the best teachers that we know we want?
Yeah.
It's a different conversation. This is about how we allow people to decide whether they can change jobs within the state, if you will. It's California, I think we all agree, if you're going to California, that's just cause.
But what are our, and this is probably a question for the other folks, but the length of contracts now, is it 3 years? Are they all 3 years?
Well, teaching contracts are 1 year.
Yes, and then they're removed.
Then there's
for
a
3
collective
years.
bargaining agreement with the association and the school board that could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can have whatever you think. They're typically in the 1 to 3 to 4 years range, depending on a lot of hosts of factors.
And though in better times, that 1 year reappointment is very concerning to someone trying to be reappointed. Because in better times, there might be a lot of people ready to sign the contract.
Right. I think the issue right now is that there's a fair amount of demand for teachers.
The demand is there today. Couldn't tomorrow.
Which has not always been the case. I heard from teachers last summer. We had some conversations. When she was hired in a Chittenden County school, there were over 200 applicants for her. She was a 4th or 5th grade teacher.
When was this?
A similar position. This was about 8 or 9 years ago, she said. Similarly, last year, I think there were 2. We are not, students in undergrad are not looking to teaching as a profession that they want to go to. And I think that's a bigger issue.
Yeah. Senator Hooker and I heard yesterday, physical educators, what was it, 7, 8 years ago up in northern, sort of Rutland County, 100 applications. Now they can't find anybody.
Well, the superintendent who's spoken,
Great.
the superintendent who's spoken to Tucker from Caledonia Central.
Yeah.
I think he said there were 190 special ed vacancies right now in the state.
Yeah. Yeah, Senator Chinnan.
So I should know this, but is there a standardized date that all teachers have to sign their contracts in each district? Is it April 15th across the board, or does each district set that contract renewal date?
Some have bargained an earlier date, and it's mostly built, my understanding is it's mostly built around town meeting and when budgets are approved. That's when schools want, okay, we've got, our budget has been approved, we want to lock, make sure we have the teaching workforce for next year, let's get them a contract. So they've negotiated something earlier that works for both sides. But by law, as you've noted, teachers have to get a contract on or before April 15. They usually get 2 weeks in which to return it. That's May 1. And until the contracts are returned, this is the real window problem for us that we brought to you, sorry, is new assignments. You don't know in South Burlington that you need a fourth grade teacher until the existing fourth grade teacher gets her contract on April 15, decides she's not going to come back next year. You learn of that on or about May 1, then it's the South Burlington School District. Oh, I better post for that fourth grade teaching position. And then by then, if I'm, I don't know if I'm in Burlington or Montpelier, oh, wait, that's a whole lot closer to my home. I'd rather be in South Burlington teaching fourth grade. And the salary's better, good for her or him. You don't even know about it until after you sign a contract for next year. And the argument is you're under contract for the next school year, you can't breach.
Senator Hooker.
So I know that some school districts allow extensions for the contract, signing the contract. Is this standardized?
There is no standard extension
And is that just,
policy that I'm aware of.
that's at the largesse of the.
It's largely at the largesse of the superintendent. And we've heard that the superintendents that testify here, and I'm sure that's right, routinely grant them. The scenario that I just portrayed, though, you've already signed your contract for the next year. How can you extend it? You've already committed
Right.
on May 1 that you're coming back to that school. But the one that's closer to your home or your child's daycare or pays better.
It just pays better.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not
That's
that,
okay.
not that all situations would be accommodated or solved by this, but if there were that extension, that extended period that was kind of a standard among the school districts, I mean, that would help to a certain extent.
Well, that's what we tried to get to with the window. I'll just say that. And we were arguing about what that looked like.
Okay, but so when you're talking about a teacher not having interference from the school, you're not talking about any specific timing on this in your statement.
Correct. You might see the position May 10th after you've signed your contract. We don't think it's appropriate for the superintendent then to affirmatively reach out to the prospective employer's superintendent and say, you can't interview, Jeff Fannin. He's under contract for next year. Well, he didn't even know about the availability for that teaching assignment until after May 1, after he signed his contract. So I can't extend what I've already signed. And that's what you heard from the two witnesses. We can bring in more. I get a couple every year. It's been going on for a good long while, 20 plus years that I've been at Vermont EA. We're here from people. I'm trying to change jobs. My superintendent has affirmatively, blocked me from interviewing. And that's the concern we have, and then why we're here with the bill.
If committee's ready, we'll shift to Mr. Francis. That's all right. And Mr. Fan, you can stay. You're okay, great. Mr. Francis.
Hi, is my audio okay?
Perfect.
Jeff Francis, excuse me, Vermont Superintendent's Association. Jay Nichols is going to do the majority of our testimony.
Okay.
But I do appreciate the ability to comment. Jeff Francis, Vermont Superintendent's Association. Ms. Zaglowski and I have an appointment in Ways and Means at 2:15, but I've just notified that committee and asked if they would email us when they're ready. So I want to just talk very, very briefly about what I've learned through this deliberation, because not having served as a superintendent myself, I was curious about why there was such a strong reaction from administrators to the proposal. And the first one that I would say that I learned is that there's a real human element to this. And we've heard from Mr. Fannin about the human side of this in terms of teachers that might want to change jobs. Superintendents have a real concern about the human element as it affects students. And I know because superintendents have reached out to committee members that they're really concerned about the stability in the school district once a teaching workforce is in place. So I know that the committee's aware of that. You've spoken about it. I wanted to reiterate it. The second comment that I'd make is that there's a concern on the part of superintendents, and you heard this rather forcefully from Superintendent Tucker, that once a contract is issued and returned, the planning process on the part of the school district commences in terms of what will transpire for the ensuing year. So if an at-will relationship is established on behalf of the teacher so that she can sign her contract and then at any point choose not to fulfill it, that has a destabilizing and disruptive effect on the school district itself. And I understand that there's a balance that needs to be struck between what the rights of the teacher might be and the stability of the school system. But the reason that superintendents and other administrators have responded to the proposal in the way they have is because we're dealing with an extremely destabilized environment in public education right now. And the districts that are concerned about out-migration of teachers that could result from the passage of 162, and I'll return to that in a minute, are really concerned about making sure that they have the best educational opportunity in place for the students within that school district. So the human element, which extends from the teacher to the students, superintendents feel need to be brought into balance and not have a situation where really teachers could test the just cause provision outside of any really good method for determining just cause and disrupt the stability in a school district. And I would say that the risks of that are greater in the current environment than they have ever been before. And then the third thing that I would say is that under the current collective bargaining construct, there are many protections that are afforded to teachers that they avail themselves of once they have their contract in place. So when you consider, the sense of justice, as it were, to be able to sign up to have those protections and then leave them in order to go to another place, I think doesn't strike people as fair. Now, Mr. Fannin talked about the effort at compromise that was suggested by the NEA at the end of a very lengthy process. We didn't have many weeks to meet in order to help resolve this, but I would say that there were, probably 8 or 10 interactions and a couple of 2-hour meetings. So it isn't as though we didn't make an effort at this. Our associations, the management associations, as Mr. Fannin refers to them, were working within the dates in S-162 as introduced by Senator Perchlik. And we were working hard to create a window, which was what was envisioned in S-162, that would be agreeable to everybody. And I think that the management association, so-called, reached a point where we would have been able to work with our members who were still reluctant about extending a window to a place where we would have had agreement among the associations. But it was at or around that point that Mr. Fannin said that a window would not work, if my recollection serves me. And he came in with the language that he proposed to you earlier in the conversation. And that language really does nothing other than codify a practice that would allow teachers to leave at any time and test the just cause provision. If my memory serves me correctly, and I'll be checked on this by Mr. Fan and Ms. Zaglowski and Mr. Nichols, we looked at the language and suggested that a superintendent could make a just cause determination and then have it subject to appeal, but to the Secretary of Education, for example. And if my memory serves me correctly, and it may not, I'm willing to stand corrected, that was not agreed to by the NEA. So we both worked around the dates that were in the bill, and we worked around the language that the NEA brought to us on the last day. The language that was brought to us about non-interference by the superintendent, I think, was language that we would have been willing to discuss, provided that the superintendent had some authority to make a determination around just cause. And the reason that we felt that was a reasonable approach is because I have heard, like you have heard, that in many, many instances, superintendents will listen to a teacher and say, you're making a compelling case. You need to be released from your contract because you have a contract, and we're willing to do that. We also have heard that superintendents have been willing to extend the time period in which teachers can return their contracts so as to afford them the opportunity to continue to look for a job. And as far as I know, and I would be corrected on this as well, there are only a couple of known instances where teachers' rights to take another job have been interfered with. At least the witnesses that Vermont NEA brings to the table in that regard were the same witnesses 3 years ago that they were this year. So I don't think that the interference is pervasive by any stretch, but I will conclude by saying we were willing and still are willing to try to effect a compromise either around the window or an ability for a superintendent to make a just cause determination when he or she is approached by a teacher who wants to leave their position. That's not binding on anybody who was subject to the negotiation, but that is a mindset that we were discussing up until the point that we decided that we weren't going to get any further.
Mr. Francis, do you have actual language that you would share? And by you, I mean, also, I think Ms. Zaglowski and Mr. Nichols, sort of your proposal. Do you have something that you might email us, just so we get these two proposals on the table?
Yeah, well, I'll say this, and we didn't complete the discussion. We were working with on the table, as it were, was a May 15 timeline with an automatic 2-week extension, which would take us to May 31st or June 1. So that was what the management associations were discussing. We didn't have the authority to agree with that for the reasons that we're here today. There's really strong feelings on both sides of this issue, but that was what we were willing to work with. And then when Mr. Fannin came in with his addendum to that first section, we started to discuss the prospects for a just cause determination with appeal by the superintendent, but that didn't fly. That was a concept that we were willing to discuss. What we were not willing to discuss was simply that non-interference clause, which in effect would codify the practice that the NEA seems to support, which is a teacher can interview for, accept an offer of, and take a position at any time, with the only impediment to that or obstruction to that being a just cause provision, which would either go immediately to the AOE or to the courts, I think. I'm not an expert on that. So I think we could put that language, to answer your question directly, we could submit language along those lines. But I would stress that we never were able to make an agreement because we never got to the point where we had provisions that we could take back to our respective boards.
The only piece that everyone is agreed on is if we send out your compromises on section 2 and 3, S-162, that there's something there. I mean, I'm just saying that's the part that, you know, there's some agreement on. I'd like to get somewhere in section 1, but that sounds like that's a possibility. Mr. Francis, do you want to shift to Mr. Nichols at this point?
I would like to. I'm going to shoot over to Ways and Means. I will get back as quickly as I can.
Mr. Nichols, thanks for joining us.
Yes,
And
good
thanks
afternoon.
I think you've been one of the leads on this, so thanks so much for doing it.
Yeah, I'd like to say my pleasure, but I do appreciate the efforts that Jeff and Sue made. I've got several points I want to make. I hope you'll bear with me. Please feel free to interrupt for questions. I'll try not to repeat points that Mr. Francis made. First of all, Jeff Fan is correct. We did make, I believe, strong improvements to section 2 and section 3 that we all agree on. The issues, and Jeff Francis has mentioned these a little bit. We talked about opening the window a little bit. If this bill, the way that Vermont EA has added the language in with that one sentence came into being, in my opinion, it wouldn't open the window a little bit. It would break the window and knock down the whole wall and damage the house. The status quo language that no superintendent shall interfere with a teacher's right to interview, offer, accept position, that's major problem language because it's on both sides of it. And I was a superintendent for 10 years. I've lived this life. I was a superintendent of Essex. It was great. I could steal from anybody I wanted to, and I get all kinds of applicants every year. Superintendent of Franklin Northeast, not so much, because we were a poor area and it was a lot harder. I apologize. My wife's texting me and I can't shut off the ring thing. Third world problems, not first world problems. Also, I wanted to mention that if I'm a superintendent and Senator Perchlik's applying to be a third grade teacher for me, and I can't be involved at all, and I interview him or my staff does, and we recommend him to be our candidate, and let's say it's, July 15th and or July 14th, and I don't know these under contract someplace else. I'm the superintendent. I can't interfere. I can't even ask that question, right? That's how our lawyers interpret that. So in that situation, I have to stay out of it. So does the superintendent he's currently working for. Then he gets hired and I find out he's under contract someplace else. Who decides if there's just cause? Now, the way it's always been in my career is that the superintendent determines whether it's just cause. And if the teacher doesn't agree with the superintendent, they go to the AOE. I would say I probably had requests for extension for contracts from probably 120, 130 teachers in my 10 years at Franklin Northeast. I said no to 0 of them. So I just want to be clear about that. And that's one of the poorer districts, one of the districts that we're talking about. So I'm really concerned that if we put that sentence in there, it's going to put us in a position where the AOE, who already is overwhelmed, is trying to take care of these problems. And so once it gets settled, Mr. Perchlik goes to the AOE and they decide that whatever his situation is a just cause allowable situation. Now I'm in what? August? By the time it all gets settled and stuff, going through the AOA, and now I've got to find a third grade teacher when I already had a third grade teacher in place who's helped me create the schedule, who's worked with me on the student rosters, who knows which third graders are doing what. And now all of a sudden in August, I have to go out and find a third grade teacher when I have 0 applicants. That's the real situation that we're putting kids in if we do this. Mr. Fannin also mentioned that there have been no cases that have gone to the AOE in the last 20 years that caused any lawsuits or anything. Then what's the point of what's the problem? What's the problem we're trying to fix here? We've got a couple teachers who have each year who bring concerns to us. Let's try to address those with a Band-Aid and not by just doing brain surgery here that affects everybody. And that's the worry that I have. We also mentioned about superintendents allowing people to get rid of their contract. What I want to really point out, and I want this to be really clear, in Vermont, teachers essentially have tenure after 2 years in the same school. People don't like to hear that, but it's the truth. The only way they can be removed is by just cause after they've had 2 years in the state or 2 years in a school district in the same position.
Mr. Nichols, is that presumptive tenure or is that actual tenure?
Well, it's presumptive tenure in that I've got a job. I automatically have the job offer. You cannot take it away from me without going through just cause. And the way that just cause works is it goes through the collectively bargained agreement. Or in the last couple of years, it's actually gone through, it would go through the court system first, through the school board first, and then the collectively bargained agreement. We've agreed with language with Mr. Fannin that would change that, so it would just go through the CBA, because we agree with him that it's silly to have a teacher have to go through two processes. So it would go to an arbitrator would make the decision. Arbitrators tend to rule for the most part in favor of employees, and they should, because the standard should be really high. It shouldn't be just that a superintendent wants to get rid of a teacher because they make too much money or something along those lines. It needs to be that they really need to be replaced as a teacher, that they're doing instructional damage or some other type of damage in the classroom. So as a teacher, I know as of April 15th, I'm going to get a contract. And the only way they can get rid of me before April 15th, if I've been there for 3 years or 30 years, is to say just cause. Now, principals, superintendents, and people in the regular society do not have that protection. We're talking about somebody having a contract and being able to search for another job. Certainly, I could do that if I worked for Handy Toyota selling cars. I could leave and give 2 weeks notice and get my job. Handy Toyota could also give me 2 weeks notice and say, you know what, Jay, you're selling cars okay, but you're really not selling that Prius very well. We're going to go in a different direction. Here's your 2 weeks pay. See you later. Management can't do that with teachers. Even teachers who are not effective, that are not really strong, you have to prove just cause. They have that protection. Other jobs do not have that. That's part of the trade-off. In terms of, I'm just responding to some of the questions that came up. In terms of the local collective bargaining agreement, CBAs can provide more or less protections to teachers. They can't provide less than what the law calls for, but it can be a CBA that says everybody has a contract by March 1st or whatever it is. So there is more protections for teachers in CBA. I think it was Senator Hooker, but I'm not sure because I can't really see you that well, that talked about the idea of it being a local bargaining issue, like Connecticut does. You know, we would be fine with that. What's that?
Senator Lyons.
Oh, Senator Lyons. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I asked that question.
Yeah, you both are so awesome. I have trouble telling you apart, you know? Anyway, that could be something that could happen that might happen in this situation. I also want to mention that in a lot of this conversation, there's no consideration given to kids. The quality of the teacher in front of the classroom, as Jeff Fannin said, is the most important thing that schools control. Schools that have to replace a quality teacher late in the year or before the year starts, or even during the year with no date, put themselves in a position where their students will not have, or are less likely to have, qualified teachers in front of them. My grandson's an 8th grader. He goes to Berkshire Elementary School. In middle school, he's an 8th grader, so he's in middle school for 3 years. He's had the same math teacher. Every other teacher has changed. They turn over all the time. To say that teachers don't have the ability to move is just not factual. You know, that district loses 15 to 20% of their teachers every year. You could talk to Jen Bossinger over in Kingdom East, same thing. Those poorer districts, rural districts, lose teachers every year. Teachers are constantly finding a way to take jobs in Chittenden County and in areas that pay more. And it's almost always about pay. Not always, but almost always about pay. Let's see. So teachers are already fluid. I don't see why that's an issue. I mentioned the at-will employees. It's a one-way contract. And that's my comments on what Jeff Fannin said. I'd like to share about 5 more minutes of stuff with you and then take any questions you have. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. So first of all, we have an equity gap increase for students based on the pandemic. Students that are historically marginalized are not doing as well as students that are not. There's research all over the country that demonstrates this. To take away strong teachers from those students is going to exacerbate that gap. There's nobody that disagrees with that knows anything about instructional quality. There are huge teacher workforce issues. It's hard finding employees now. To have employees be able to leave the last minute and to put schools that pay less or that are in rural areas under the knife where it's harder for them to find somebody is not fair to those kids. This would lead to even more one-sided contracts. District would be stuck with teachers, even if they didn't think they were that good a teacher. At the same time, teachers could shop around. And it would be just too bad for the teachers and students that are left behind that have to deal with what happens when a teacher leaves. There's already way too much turnover in teachers. You're fixing a very minor issue with a very major change that will have far-reaching negative consequences, especially to most vulnerable and marginalized students. Our associations were willing to work with different dates than the June 15th date contemplated in S-162. We worked from Senator Pershlick's bill. Vermont NEA wasn't interested in any of the dates and indeed seems to believe that June 15th is too early a date for teachers to be bound to contracts. And I respect that. They're trying to represent their members. Even though school districts are bound to them the moment the teacher signs them. Teachers already move from rural and or less resource districts at a rate that negatively impacts student learning. Why make that worse? Clearly, teachers are able to change jobs when we have places that have attrition rates of 15 to 25% here in our state, in our poorer districts. Why make the field even more unstable? The state, and especially in the legislative education committees, has an obligation to look at any law through the lens of service to all students. Any law that has the impact of hurting our poorest and most marginalized communities goes against our premise that we believe in equity for all students. You heard personal stories from two teachers, only two examples, one of which has to do with a superintendent who's no longer a superintendent. And in all my years as a superintendent, that person never came to any of the superintendent meetings or never was involved in any of our stuff. I have talked over a dozen teachers since Saturday. I've asked each the same question. Should teachers be allowed to break a signed contract in the summer or during the school year? A few said yes, as long as they had a real compelling reason. Most said no, because it would be unfair to the school and students left behind because the school would not be able to find a suitable replacement. Now, to be fair, I didn't ask the question of teachers in districts with a lot of money. I asked it of teachers working in poor communities and communities where I live. And I asked of veteran teachers who were loyal to their schools. Every teacher I talked to was a Vermont NEA member. I'd be more than happy to ask them to testify. They all shared in one way or another how hard it was to replace a teacher in the summer and nearly impossible during the school year. They also all agree that during the hiring season, teachers should have the opportunity to look around for other jobs. If S-162 was enacted, it would be unfair to school districts, the teachers left behind, and this law will hurt kids. If the goal is to support better resource districts at the expense of poorer districts, it's a good bill. This will hurt kids. You are the education committee, not the labor committee. And I mean that with all due respect. Kids are counting on you to put their needs first. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Questions for Mr. Nichols? Senator Pershlick.
Yeah. You want me to go now or?
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Nichols, for your testimony and all the work you've been doing trying to find a compromise and talking to different superintendents and principals and other school administrators. But I wasn't sure in your testimony if it was all about the bill or about the language that Mr. Fannin had presented. Can you clarify?
Yeah, that's
that?
a great question. I should have been more clear about that, Senator Perchik. Thank you. I would have problems with the bill because of the June 15th date. Some of my members, I floated the May 15th date, floated that right from the beginning with my members, and I got negative pushback from my members. But I do think that at least gives them a couple weeks of the school year so that they can bring in people and see them teach and hopefully be able to replace candidates with teachers with qualified candidates. So something like that, some compromise like that, my members aren't going to like it, but I can see that does kind of split the middle a little bit. If you go after the school year starts or allow teachers to leave after the school year starts or during the school year, that's my biggest concern. I've been around a long time. There's never been a situation that worries me more than this does, ever.
And I agree that having teachers leave at the last minute or in the middle of the school year or to break a contract, it was not my goal of introducing the bill to allow teachers to break contracts. That wasn't the goal. It was to create a time where they don't have to sign them. So if they try to do that window thing that you've talked about. So I take offense a little bit saying there's no consideration of the students. I think that, so I don't know if you were directing those comments to Mr. Fannin's proposal, but that was something that I thought about. And I think having good teachers is good for the students. And I think if we're already having 15% of the teachers leaving, this isn't going to make it any worse. If they are already finding a way to leave, then those are other issues. And those are the like equity issues that we're dealing with the people waiting. Like if there are districts that cannot find the resources to pay their teachers better, well then hopefully that bill will find, at least allow their school boards the opportunity to provide more resources. That it would be a local decision to whether they follow through on that, but that's what we'd be providing for them with those changes. And I think that's essential. I kind of see this as hand in hand, that would provide those other resources to those under-resourced schools to make them more attractive places to be teachers. But if you want to have the best teaching, you need to have good teachers and give teachers a reason to be the best teachers they can be. You don't want to, I don't know if you're doing the best teaching if you want to move but can't to a different district. But that said, I just wanted to say I am thinking about the students, so I wanted to comment on that. But I do also understand your point that this isn't the biggest problem. We're not having hundreds of teachers get denied this. And like you said, most superintendents and the ones that I've talked to do offer the extensions. I'm not sure how the extensions works if they don't know if there's a new job opening. So, my intent was just to find, to create that window issue and not to cause, disruption. I think some of the emails that I'm getting from superintendents are not accurate in the intent of what the bill was, but I understand how that works. So I'm okay with that. But I think if there's a way to find a way just to make it a little bit easier and clearer for those teachers that find themselves in those situations, and particularly to ask, what I heard from some teachers is that they're not too sure. They just want to maybe go interview, but if to ask a superintendent, they're afraid that kind of changes the relationship with their current employer. And that was another thought that I had. And the only other thing that I wanted to say was all other unionized employees have the same rights. It's not just, you're right, if you're selling used cars, you don't have it. But if you're a police officer and you're in the union, you have a very important job, and it's difficult for that community to maybe find another police officer really quick. And that's a very important job for the community, but they can go and get another job with another town. And it's probably a similar issue where small town police officers go work for bigger towns to make more money. But it's not, the teachers aren't the only ones with these rights, is what the point I wanted to make.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
Thank you for your comments, Senator Perchlik. And I wasn't trying to imply that you or the committee didn't care about kids. I want to make sure you knew the impact this would have on kids. The plain language of the bill right now would allow until June 15th. That will hurt kids. I think that's indisputable. There's nobody who studies education instructional research that's going to argue with that. Well, that's just a fact. The second part of that, you made some great points, but another point is the police and fire department. Firemen need to be trained. There's no question about it. And they're going to put out a fire. They come out with basic training. They're going to do that. Teaching takes more time to be good at. The research, and Don Tinney, the Vermont NEA, worked on some of this research with me back when we were working on the state evaluation system. We found, through national research, that it takes on average about 6 or 7 years for a teacher to get to that really high level of teaching. And what happens in a lot of these poorer schools is they don't ever get teachers there. And it's not often because they want to leave because they don't like their principal or any of that stuff. If that was the case, we'd see a lot more people leaving from higher paying districts. It's about pay and benefits. And I'm all for tackling that. I think many teachers in the state of Vermont are underpaid. And I'm okay for tackling that. And if there's a way to tackle that, I've mentioned before, I can remember saying 20 years ago in this committee and George Cross yelling at me, look at a statewide teacher's contract. If you want to be serious about it, do something like that helps Vermont show that all kids matter to us equally. Because right now the deck is stacked against poorer communities. And I think we need to find ways to address that. And I think the Brigham decision helped do that a little bit. I'm hoping Act 173 is going to help do that. But I think we need to keep that in mind for all decisions we make, those unintended consequences. And I do think a date of May 15th or something like that could be something we could live with. Or even the proposal that Jeff Francis made to Jeff Fannin, where the superintendent determines if it's just cause or not. If you don't agree with the superintendent, you go to Dan French, and Dan French decides. that also seems like a pretty easy fix. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I know some states are moving in the direction, I think it's New Mexico, saying, at minimum, you have to pay teachers this amount. I mean, you don't get away with these starvation salaries in rural America. You're actually stepping up and saying, hey, because that's really the issue that we're really trying to address here. Or not through this, but that's one of the problems that we're kind of thinking about as it relates to this. Center line, please.
Well, so just going back to some of the initial comments that you made and that Jeff Fannin made, and knowing that June 15th is not the date that you would like to see in the bill, how close did you get? What is the window that you might find acceptable?
If you're talking about us working together, and Jeff Fannin can correct me, but my understanding is that Vermont NEA said that none of the dates were acceptable to them, including June 15th. And in fairness to Jeff Fannin, he's told me for a couple of years that they don't want any date. They want teachers to be able to look for other jobs, essentially whenever they want to. And I understand why he wants that. But I just think that would be devastating for kids. So I think we could live with a date, a May 15th type of date, where contracts had to be in a May 30th, or you did a May 1st, but people could get an automatic 2-week extension. That's another proposal that we made. So in other words, the Senator Persick's applying for that 3rd grade job for me. And on May 1st, he says, I don't want to sign my contract, Jay. I want to keep looking for other jobs. He could get an extension automatically to May 30th, and he could still sign his contract on May 30th. But during that time, he could be looking. There are ways I think we can compromise a little bit, but it's very scary for management when you're trying to staff a school and making sure that you've got qualified people in place for your students. And you should maybe have a conversation with some of these superintendents of these real poor communities, like Jen Bossinger over in Kingdom East, Lynn Coda, who took my place in Franklin Northeast. Some of those districts, they could tell you some stories about people that they have in the classroom that they've hired them because they have no choice.
Senator Lance, did you have a follow-up?
No, that's
Okay.
good, thank you.
Senator Hooker.
Thank you. So Jeff, with that truncated date, then would the sentence about non-interference from superintendents be as onerous?
You're talking Mr. Nichols or Jeff? And who are you asking?
For
Jay.
Jay, sorry, did I say Jeff? The Jay.
I know, love Jay.
I paid attention really closely until you said Jeff, and I lost the last thread of the question. Can you repeat it?
5 minutes ago, you said she was the greatest person on earth. And now you're telling me you're not even paying attention to it.
So the question was, with the truncated date, if you came to an agreement on the date and, the end of May or whatever, would the sentence about superintendents not interfering be as onerous as you indicated it would be if the date were widened?
Yeah, I think it would still be problematic because by having that sentence in there, you're putting it in play where a person could apply for a job anytime they want, and the superintendents on both ends of the equation couldn't even ask them if they're under contract or any of those types of things. Instead, if you put a date in there like May 1st to, final date of May 30th or whatever, May 15th, whatever you decided, then during that time, the person wouldn't have a contract yet, but a contract would be there waiting for them. They wouldn't have actually signed a contract. They'd be saying, yeah, I'm going to wait until May 30th. I've got the legal right to do that. I'm looking for other jobs. And the other advantage to that is the superintendent could then advertise the job as an anticipated opening. So they could at least hopefully get a few applicants in the pipeline in case, in this case, Senator Persick took that 3rd grade job. Hope that makes sense and answers your question.
Senator Persick.
Yeah, so since I keep being brought up as the example, so Jay, this is what I'm trying to figure out with the window. So if I am a 3rd grade teacher when you were up in Franklin, and I like it there. I think Jay's a great superintendent, and I want to stay there, but I live in Montpelier or something. So I live far away, and I'm not looking to find a new job. So when you say, here's the new contract, I sign it like that day. I'm like, yeah, I like this job. I'm going to stay. But then I'm in the grocery store in 2 weeks, and I meet the principal of Montpelier, and I'm like, oh, Andy, you're a 3rd grade teacher, right? Well, our 3rd grade teacher just had to quit because their spouse moved to California. Can you come here? And they say, Oh, well, I can't because I just signed this thing with Jay, so they have to go get the extension. So it seems like the date, if we just move the date, and I don't know if that helps, because they would have just signed the contract. They weren't really looking for a new job. But if a new job opened up, that was a job they really liked and it changed their commute or daycare or whatever it was, it's in the same district as their child, but there was no job opening there. I mean, often when I talk to people about this, on the side of the administration, they act like there's going to be this exodus, but there has to be a job to go to. They're not just leaving to go to some other job. There has to be new teaching positions. But that said, I understand the difficulty these poor districts have of keeping those teachers there to get to that expert level of year 7. But I'm wondering if how you see that example that I gave, that I'm not looking for a new job, but a new job opens up after I've signed my contract. Does the language you guys talked about address that? I think your answer is going to be your proposal that would allow the teacher to go to the superintendent and say, oh, is this just cause that this is just a better fit for me and my family, this job that opened up after I signed our contract?
Yeah, that's my answer 100%. And they already have that right. They can come to me, and teachers have done that with me. They've said, I'm moving to a place that's closer to my home or whatever the reason might be. And if they come to me on July 15th, I'm saying no. And I'm saying,
Well, no, yeah, not July.
but they come to me anytime in a normal time, I'm going to say, okay, because if I say no, and they go to the Secretary of Ed, I'm going to lose every time. I don't know the superintendent who's ever won at the education level of the secretary. Usually if a teacher brings it there for just cause, they usually get a pretty good reason. And it could be, I'm driving 50 miles and now I'll be able to drive 5. And typically, I mean, at least when Rebecca was the secretary, she would be like, I'm sorry, I consider that just cause. And we would just have to figure it out as superintendents and fill the position. So I think the mechanism is already in place.
Okay, so you don't see the change of the date as changing that?
I don't think so. And again, I don't know how Dan French rules on these things because when he became secretary, I was already here. So I've never had to deal with him on those issues, but I dealt with Rebecca and Armando, and they both made it pretty clear, unless the teacher had a really terrible reason, they were probably going to support the teacher, which I'm fine with.
Other questions? Mr. Fallon, do you want to add anything at this point?
I do.
Because I would like, I'd like to get somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't like the sort of keeping teachers locked in, I'd like some flexibility. I'd like to do something this year.
Right. Well, thank you. And thank you, Jeff Francis, for reminding me. My name is Jeff Van. I'm Executive Director of Vermont EA. Thank you for letting me speak with you today. A couple of responses to Jay Nichols.
Yeah.
I think are important here. The context of the June 15th, the Senator Perchlik's bill, the date there, we were agreeable to it. We wouldn't have been out, you wouldn't have sent us out, if you will, to the cafeteria.
Yeah.
If we weren't, and so we were. So I think you just heard from Mr. Nichols was what we were up against, right? In normal times, I think the word he just used a few minutes ago, in normal times, I'd grant the extension or upwards of May 15th. We never, that was the window that we were searching for. We are fine with June 15th as compared to the House. And this is where I think Jay was talking about. The House has no date in it. That would be preferable to us, but we are agreeable to the June 15th in the Senate bill. It's imperfect in some ways, but it's a reasonable window. And so we are also, to think about the students, we all, say that and mean it, I think, sincerely. But there are kids who don't have a teacher that has a vacancy. And those group of students also deserve a great teacher. And so if there's a vacancy in another school, those kids are going without until they do have a teacher in front of the classroom. So it's a problem in either district, if you will. And we're just making sure that a teacher lands in the school district that makes the most sense for him or her to be in. That's all.
Because that's going to translate into teaching and,
absolutely
wanting to be there. Absolutely.
So, Vermont is sort of the outlier in our neighbors, and I will check with Maine. Massachusetts
Okay.
and Rhode Island, and get to that as soon as I can. We did provide multiple windows to talk about. We just didn't get there, honestly. And so that's why we came back to it. All right, we're trying to figure out this window issue. Let's try a different approach. That was the language that where we were and what I read to you earlier. And as to this not being a huge problem, I agree. It's not thousands of people having this problem annually, but it has been a perpetual problem. I've been at Vermont EA for 20 plus years. I would say we get several every single year, 2 to 3 people who are blocked from interviewing at a new job by their superintendent, in some way interfering with their right to look for a new job. That's not okay. We are here for that reason and that reason only. And on this provision. So I think that if, Lord Mansfield many years ago, the judge of the court of the Exchequer in England said it's not a parade of witnesses. If we need a parade of witnesses, we can do that. I think we can certainly do that. We thought we'd bring 2 compelling people with a compelling story to tell. And certainly if the committee needs more witnesses, we can provide them. I'm certain of that, who have been negatively affected by being blocked from interviewing or even exploring options. So the window concept that you get now, I think Jay and I and others have been pretty clear about it. The question is there a way to navigate it? We thought, I think, sincerely, I thank them. I appreciate all of their efforts. We tried to get there, we didn't. As for Jeff Francis's suggestion that the AOE weigh in on just cause, if I remember correctly, Thursday, which was our last meeting with them, their own attorney didn't think that was advisable. Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Chris Leopold liked the idea of turning to the AOE and letting them make these decisions about what's just cause for schools and for teachers. So I don't think that was anybody thought was the appropriate landing spot for it. It's an intriguing idea, perhaps. We're brainstorming in fairness to everybody and trying to get to yes. But I don't think they thought it was themselves really doable.
So I need to understand, so are you adhering to the June 15th date totally? But you would not be, you wouldn't consider the May 1st through 30th concept?
Well, again, it was a little bit loose in the language here today, and that's some, we would like it if we're going to, I think May 15th, then you have to go back to your superintendent. This is that concept of,
Yeah.
I don't know. And then in very few, if this is the only, I say very few, because I'm not aware of anybody else, where you have to go back to your employer and seek permission to interview for a new job. That's the challenge. And they get the authority to say no. That's the setup here.
So to your point, Chair Campion, I just want to say I too want to see some movement here, and I am very supportive of some date or window making it easier for teachers to find jobs that pay more money. I think because that brings out the best in teaching. They're going to work harder to be really good teachers that other places that want to hire them, that benefits the kids. I also think it motivates superintendents to treat their teachers well so that the teachers want to stay. So I am supportive of moving something forward. And I would just say that it is managerial function for staffing issues. So managerial functions when enrollment fluctuates, when you get new students, you have to hire over the summer, unforeseen health issues. I know that too. So I mean, teachers are going to move, they're going to be lateral, and I'm happy to talk about equitable pay so that the poor districts, I don't know if I like that term or not, can be addressed. But I too, Chair Campion, would like to see some movement move forward on this to give teachers the ability to get better pay throughout the state.
Were you going to say something else, Mr. Banner? Otherwise, Mr. Nichols has his hand
Oh,
up.
go for it.
Go ahead, Jay.
Remember how to lower my hand here. Okay. Just a couple things. The June 15th date, I wasn't under the impression that Vermont EA was okay with that date. And if they are, I stand corrected on that. I do know that Jeff has told me many times, which he just alluded to, that the House bill is more preferable to them because there's no date. May 15th or 30th is much better, I think, than what we have right now in the eyes of labor. If that's the case, that sounds like a pretty good compromise to me. It allows management to actually see teachers teach when they hire them, as opposed to having it happen, at least most of the time. The point that Senator Chittenden made is right. You are going to have those circumstances, and it's very difficult in those circumstances. And usually you end up with somebody who is not skilled, and you have somebody who's not even licensed in that area teaching for a year until you can hopefully find somebody. So it's a huge problem, and it is an equity issue for kids. I did want to mention the same exact teachers testified 3 years ago. And I know Jeff could bring other teachers and we could bring other people too. But the one thing I really take exception to is Jeff keeps saying about the right to interview. If I'm under contract and under current law, I don't have a right to interview and accept another job. I don't believe that. The law says if I'm under contract, I'm teaching in that district the next year. The law is clear on that. So I don't think I have the right to go out and apply for other jobs. So what superintendents have always done is ask people, are you under contract to another district? And if the answer is yes, they don't interview you because you're already under contract. So if we change the law so that the contract is later and people are applying for jobs while they're not under contract or during a window, I've got no problem with that if it's something that works. And the last thing I want to say is superintendents can't just say no. The system right now, the superintendent says no, the teacher goes to the agency of education. The agency of education says they have just cause. That's it. Now, I do agree that Chris Leopold was leery of the idea of having the AOE be the arbiter on this. But his point was he thought it should just be the superintendent. So Jeff, I mean, I would love that, but I'm quite sure that Vermont EA is not going to want that. And I understand why. At least this way, if the superintendent says no, it can go to Secretary French. And again, it's a couple cases a year.
If I respond to that, Jay, here's the problem though. This is what we talked about. By that point, the job is come and gone. Right? You go to the agency of education to make some determination about just cause, whether I have just cause to interview for a new job. That job is come and gone. And so it's really a solution that really is not practical because the timelines have come and gone. And this is what you're experiencing what we did. We went around and had a lot of good conversations last week. And finding the sweet spot was.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you doing that. I don't want to get into it too much here, but yeah, it's giving us a flavor for the conversations. Senator Persley.
Yeah, one of the questions that I had, which was from one of the witnesses who said they had signed a letter of intent, and I don't know if that's actually what it was or what, but they said it was a letter of intent, but it was viewed as a contract by the superintendent. And I don't know if that's something that's possible to create a letter of intent. So in my example, when Jay offers me the job, it's like, yeah, of course, I love it here. I'm going to sign this. But if some great job opens up next door, I want to be able to just go interview for that job. So I don't know, instead of saying you just have longer to return the contract, but allows you a time frame to say, yeah, I'm going to come back. So then if it's a letter of intent, you're like, yeah, I'm going to come back unless some great job opens up in the next, whatever the time frame is in that window. I'm assuming that's one of the things you guys talked about, but that kind of allows you to tell your existing school, yeah, I'm going to come back unless some great opportunity arises, and then allow them to go pursue that opportunity if it arises without breaking the contract or going through some kind of administrative approval to the secretary or AOE. Is that something that was discussed at all or makes sense?
I think, Jeff Fannin, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's kind of the second or third proposal that the superintendents put forward. I wasn't part of that. I read it and everything, but I think Jeff Francis put forward something that was similar like that, where you'd get a contract and you didn't have to sign it. You could just ask them to hold it for you. I don't think we ever talked about letters of intent, though. I think it was going to be a contract, and whatever that date was, you had until then to return it. We'd still have to address your question earlier. What happens if I sign a contract because I really want to come back, and then all of a sudden my dream job opens up that's closer to home or where my spouse or whatever. So we'd still have to find a way to address that. Jeff Fannin, am I remembering that accurately?
Well, it's a little bit, but Jay, you're right in some sense of the word. The problem it's the same problem, right? Everybody gets a letter of intent, if you will, or has Jeff Francis talked about being offered a contract that sits on the table for a period of time.
Right.
Then everybody's got the same contract statewide. I think that's the issue that we raised is, you don't know when there's an available position. So while you may be able to interview at a new place, there may not be an available position for you in Montpelier, using your example, Senator Berkeley.
Well,
So,
if there is, the idea that there's like 2 dates or instead of 1 date, but then you'd have to have teachers to be like upfront and honest or early as possible to say like, I'm not signing the letter of intent because I'm retiring or moving. And then they would know before the second date if there is that other job opening in the dream location.
A lot of jobs on School Spring right now, Senator Perchlik, and it's only March 8th. Hundreds
A lot
of
of
them,
what?
maybe a lot of jobs, teacher jobs open, hundreds of them, maybe thousands right now in School Spring.
Because teachers do tell they're gonna.
Most teachers
they're
are
gonna
pretty
leave.
honest about it. They care about their kids. And if I'm going to retire, and I know I'm going to retire, I'm going to tell you because I really want you to hire a good 3rd grade teacher to take my place. That's why I hired you to replace me in that 3rd grade scenario.
Senator Persick, do you feel as though you've heard enough now around where things are at that you might be willing to bring a new proposal to the committee? Because the Senate's going to take a position on this. I've been instructed Thursday, meaning it votes out Friday. What's our position going to be on S-162? You've heard a lot of the back and forth. Would you be willing to do that?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So we'll look to Senator Perchlik to bring in a new proposal. If the 2 of you wouldn't mind sharing your agreement on sections 2 and 3
sure.
with Senator Perchlik, that would be great. He can have those drafted up, and then he can look at section 1, and he's heard this, so he can bring a new proposal to the table. And I know there's been a lot of discussion, even today, Mr. Francis mentioned it, the House does have another bill. And I recognize that, but the Senate's position is going to be what the Senate's position is, and we're going to fight for whatever the Senate's position ends up being. So just a reminder that how that works when things go to committee of conference, etc. So, Senator Hooker,
Thank
please.
you. Just a quick question, going back to my question about superintendents who leave in the middle of the year. How is that contract handled? If a superintendent, like happened in my area recently, somebody just left for another job, who do they have to ask if they can apply for that job?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's just, and I've had to deal with several of those situations with superintendents and principals. What happens is it's the same as teachers. So if I'm a superintendent, I'm in Vermont, I can't leave to go to another job in Vermont, but I can leave to go to any other state anytime I want. There's nothing you can really do about it except for tell me I can't be a superintendent in Vermont for the rest of the year. It's the same for teachers. If I'm a 3rd grade teacher and I decide I want to go to New Hampshire, doesn't matter what Vermont law says, I can go and teach in New Hampshire. So it's the same for teachers, principals, and superintendents for that. We have no power over them if they leave the state, Senator.
Terrific. Anything else at this point? So Senator Persick will bring in a new draft. We'll take a look at that likely tomorrow, or at least the outline of it, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, Mr. Nichols. Really appreciate it. Committee,
Thank
let's
you.
take 10 minutes